Hello and welcome to the course Developing Soft Skills and Leadership through Indian Knowledge System. In today's lecture, which is titled Arthashastra Principles and Financial Decisions, which means economic policy and financial decisions, we shall be talking about how in Indian knowledge system the idea of economic policy, economic principles and financial decisions have been highlighted. The texts particularly that we are going to refer would be Kautilya's Arthashastra, right, though we can also refer to other examples from Indian knowledge system. So, let us quickly begin with this particular concept, that how and what kind of principles have been emphasized in Indian knowledge system, particularly if we look at the text called the Arthashastra, which is one of the oldest and earliest systems, systematic treatises on governance and economics, right. So, the economic principles largely come from or derived from this particular text in Indian knowledge system. This text has outlined many principles related to public finance, taxation, economic management and state administration, that is statecraft. Kautilya, who is the author of this particular text, is supposed to be the author of this particular text, Arthashastra, emphasized the economic prosperity is the foundation of political stability. That means in Indian knowledge system there is a very close connection, or in fact we are going to look at this particular aspect, that there exists a very close connections and correspondence between what we call economic prosperity, political stability and what you call the effective leadership, right. So, the effective leadership is also or may also be, that could be one of the criterias of judging what you call effective leadership, is that how economic prosperity and political stability is achieved. These both of them can be a parameter to judge particularly the what you call the effective leadership, right. And Kautilya has very well emphasized this particular idea of relationship between economic prosperity, political stability and what we call effective leadership. We know that Kautilya was the chief advisor of Chandragupta Maurya in Maurya dynasty. The text has discussed, as we have already highlighted, the ideas such as statecraft, economics, diplomacy and governance. And the text has provided us a very detailed guidance on financial administration and economic policy. And it has very well emphasized or highlighted this particular part, that the economic activities which might appear to be quite shrewd, they must remain morally grounded, right. So, though it seems to be quite difficult to achieve a moral ground in economic activity, but this is precisely how the efficiency of a particular leader is what you call involved, when you can achieve economic activity, economic prosperity through more on the basis of the moral ground. That precisely would be the case. So, if you look at the very first shloka from Kautilya's Arthashastra, we find that what he says, Arthasya moolamuthanam anarthasya vipare. That means prosperity always arises from active economic effort. So, it is a kind of an appeal, it is kind of an implorement of from a leader, that he must keep in mind always this particular fact, that prosperity is always achieved through active economic effort. That means the leader or the king should always engage himself in very actively in all kinds of economic efforts in a state in order to bring about prosperity to the state. And that prosperity, if any kind of negligence is practiced on the part of the leader, what you call the king here in that case, it may result in the decline of what you call economic prosperity. And if economic prosperity declines, there is a very close connection between what you call political stability, peace in the state and economic prosperity. In fact, the entire state fails, the entire state collapses in absence of what you call very active economic effort on the part of the leader. And therefore, Kautilya always stresses this particular fact, that productivity, enterprise and efficient economic activities are a what you call required part on the part of the leader, right? And this does not only determine the future and the fortune of the leader himself, because what he says in the next sloka is important, is that there is a very close connection between the fortune of the king, fortune of the leader, and the collective happiness of the entire subject. That means the fortune of the subject, of the people in general, and the king, or what you call the leader, are closely associated. So it's not going, it would not be kind of a personal loss of the king, but it would be a collective loss of the entire state. And that's why what he says, pragya sukhe sukham ragya prajanam tu hite hitam natma priyam hitam ragya prajanam tu priyam hitam. So you see that, how the king's happiness lies in the happiness of his subject, and how there is a very close connection between the happiness of the subject and the king. Both of the fortune of both of them are very well embedded with each other, right? So any laxity on the part of the king may result in disasters. Now the question is, how can the king bring about political stability and economic stability? In fact, if we closely observe and analyze, we would find that economic prosperity is very much rooted in what you call peace and political stability of the state. So every effort should be made by the king to practice diplomacy, because diplomacy may bring about peace to the state, right? And if diplomacy fails, what could be the results? It could result in a war or conflict or civil war within the state, right? And if there is a condition of war or conflict emerges between states, that would destroy the idea of peace and prosperity, and therefore the political stability and economic stability fails. So what Kautilya mandates for a king is that the king must view diplomacy as a key idea to leadership skill, right? That means diplomacy must be practiced by leader, and therefore successful rulers, or what we call leaders, always engage in building alliances with the states. They are always engaged in diplomacy in order to resolve conflict and maintain political relationships, because this is precisely what is important for, as I say, economic prosperity and financial decisions. In modern organizations, this idea of what you call diplomacy always translates into the fact that the leader must always be engaged in stakeholder communication, negotiation skills must be practiced, and a collaborative leadership must be established. So communication here becomes a very strategic leadership tool, or diplomacy becomes a very strategic leadership tool so far as economic policy and moral decision makings are concerned. Now if you look at principles of financial governance, Chanakya, or what you call Kautilya, has talked about that leaders should always be beyond, apart from being diplomat, should always be a little cautious, and he must, as he says, natyantam saralabhavyam gatva pashyam vanasthalim chedyante saralastatra kubjasti ishtanti padapa. Means he gives an example that you should not be very, what you call, upright in your dealings. Right? Do not be very upright in your dealings, because if you go to the forest, you would find that the straight trees are cut down while the crooked ones are left standing. So what he is exactly saying, that you should practice beyond diplomacy a little suspicious behavior, suspicious towards the people, and you must adopt other kinds of strategic methods in order to control your state, and that could be achieved by bringing about balanced taxation. That means you should always levy taxes This could bring about prosperity to the state, but at the same time your taxation must be morally grounded, and therefore they should be balanced. At the same time, you should always have a very efficient revenue administration, because due to general human nature, there could be people who might be practicing some kind of hanky-panky with revenue. Therefore, revenue administration must be very efficient of the state. This could, this is one of the financial principles of financial governance that must be practiced on the part of what you call leader. At the same time, the leader must also bring about transparency and accounting, right. So, you should not leave it on the part of your administration, rather it should be very transparent, and you must hold an accounting. And the king, or what you call the leader, must make every effort in a state to prevent any kind of practice of corruption, because the corrupt government or corrupt administration would completely be devoid of any kind of trust of the subject, and therefore it may lead to what you call the discontentment on the part of the subject. So, should avoid, every effort should be made to avoid any kind of corruption, right. And the king, while collecting tax and revenue, must make sure that you should invest in public welfare. All the works of public welfare must be practiced by the leader, or what you call king. These are the economic principles, or the principles of financial governance have been provided by Kautilya. Now, he has put up a kind of an analogy between as to how moderate taxation should be levied by the leader. And this analogy is, you see, just as a bee collects honey without harming the flower, the king should collect revenue without harming the subject, right. So, this analogy is very well fits into the idea of what you call balanced and moderate taxation without destroying the subject, without destroying the source. And you see in the case of bee, as without harming the flower at all, but it collects honey, right, and the flower exists as it is without being affected. In a similar manner, the king or the leader should collect revenue from his subjects without harming his subjects, taking care of the subject and collecting taxes at the same time. This brings about the king who is neither very upright or neither and is morally grounded at the same time. Now, if you look at the sources of state revenues, he prescribes this particular fact that what are the sources of the state revenue, and how should the king, what you call leader, should collect these revenues. It says that if you look at the sources, there are land revenues, trade and custom duties, mines and metallurgy, forest produce, state enterprise, fines and penalties. If you look at these sources, they are still relevant, though some may have been added in the modern times, but these are the basic sources of state revenue which are still relevant even today, right. And at the same time, he says that Nabhisheko na sanskara singhasya kriyante vane vikramarjite satvasya swayameva margendrata. If you look at a lion, he becomes the king of the forest, but without any rituals being performed. By the power of might alone, he is considered to be the king of the forest, right. So, you should not forget this particular fact, that while collecting revenue from these state sources, you must be in a position to demonstrate that you are the authority, the moral authority, and the revenue and everything that is being collected from the people would be used for the service of these people, right. So, if you are in a position to manage these resources in an efficient manner, you become a leader in a very natural way. As the lion becomes a king of the forest, in a very natural way without any kind of rituals are being performed. In a similar manner, if you are in a position as a leader to manage these resources of the state in a very effective manner, you would probably become a natural leader. Now, we further look at the resource management that has been prescribed in this particular text, where it says Ashwa Shastram Shastram Veena Vani Narascha Naricha Purush Vishesham Prapya Bhavanti Yogya Yogyascha. So, it says that there are a number of resources available in the state. They could be horse, weapon, science, musical instruments, speech, and man and woman, that is human resources. They all become worthy or unworthy based on who gets to use, employ, utilize them. That means a lot of resources are available in the state, but it depends upon how you are going to employ these resources, right. So, these resources can become what you call employable or worthy, or unworthy. It completely depends upon how the king or the leader is in a position to employ such kind of resources, right. So, if we look at our country, for example, a lot of resources are available, depends how these resources, right. Population, for example, is a big resource, but it depends how this resource is going to be employed in a worthy manner or an unworthy manner. Further, he emphasizes this fact that state resources might include, beyond horse, weapon, science, musical instrument, this analogy, the resources could be agriculture, trade, mining, forests, and taxation. And our modern management may parallel such kind of management through financial planning, investment strategy, operational efficiency, etc. So, organizations that manage these resources effectively achieve sustainable growth. So, what we learn from the resource management principle of Kautilya's Arthashastra is that it emphasizes on the fact that despite the fact that we are in a position to have a lot of resources, the complete growth of the organization would completely be dependent on the fact that how effectively these resources are being employed and used. While he talks about the resource and their management, at the same time the attention should be, he is very attentive of the fact that there are chances of risk and corruption within the state, and therefore he has focused on the control of risk and corruption within the state. What he states is that he has recognized this particular fact that there is a risk of corruption within administration, and therefore he wants that officials handling finances may misuse resources unless they are very closely monitored, and therefore he recommends that audit, the timely and regular and continuous audit must be performed. That means you should check the records of financial expenditures, etc., and very regular inspections must be performed. There must be an intelligence network through which you can probably find out which administrator is doing what, whether in the favor of the state or against the state, and if you find anyone who is probably neglecting his work or engaged in any kind of risk or corruption, there must be strict penalties against such kind of people. Right? And if you look at these methods, audits, inspections, intelligence network, and strict penalties, they are even today continued, right? And that therefore there is a very close resemblance between what you call modern corporate government and compliance system, right? That means the principles of Arthashastra are still relevant even today, or we may learn from Kautilya's principles of Arthashastra in order to improve the modern corporate governance. Now, we see that there is a very close and strong relationship between financial governance and political stability, right. In the very beginning of this lecture itself, I said that Arthashastra, particularly a very close analysis of Arthashastra, rather establishes a very close connection between what we call financial governance and political stability, right, or what we call economic prosperity, political stability and leadership. So, the efficiency of a leadership is judged with the fact that how financially responsible the leader is, right, and therefore, the effective leadership in order to manage finances must have very ethical financial management, right, and at the same time it must also have economic foresight. He could be in a position to see as to how the economic structure and the economic structure of the state is going to change in the coming times, and he must stay prepared for that, right. And at the same time, all kind of financial management and economic foresight must also be related with public welfare, and it must be oriented towards public welfare, right. So, you must be in a position to manage the state in a very ethically and financial ways, must be in a position to see what is coming next in terms of economics, and all your economic efforts must be directed towards public welfare. Now, we know that there are certain HR principles or human resource management that has been put forward by the author. The Arthashastra discusses how personal management should be practiced. What he advocates is that you should always engage in merit based appointments, right, that make sure that the people who are working in a system hold some kind of merit, right. They are efficient people, and very training of the officials must be provided in order to work in a state in an efficient manner, and this training must be continuous. Their conducts must be ethical, and they must hold an accountability not towards the king or what you call leader, but towards the people in general, the entire society or the state. And these principles are reflected in the modern HR parallels, because the modern HR parallels also include talent management, leadership development and performance evaluation, which closely echo what Kautilya has already prescribed in Arthashastra, right. So, human capital is always considered as a strategic asset, and therefore, the kind of people, the kind of administrators that are being appointed within a state must have these criteria, that they are merit based appointed based on their merits, and they are trained, they have ethical conduct, and therefore they have accountability towards the state. He also prescribed that decentralization of the governance must happen, right. Kautilya says that probably you should not accumulate what we call too much of power, right, within the hands of a few people. Rather, he supports delegation of authority to capable administrators, right, and these administrators may include samharta, what we call revenue collector, and this decentralization is being talked about in terms of what you call the economic management. There must be a revenue collector, there must be a treasurer, what we call sanidhata, and there must be akshapatal dhyaksha, that means the chief accountant, right. So, the delegation of authority, delegation of work of economic management must be performed, because this brings about a very efficient governance, and it brings about faster decision making and accountability, right. So, you prescribe certain kind of economic work to a particular person, and the person is be in a position to make decisions and have accountability, right. So, delegation is the thing that he has been prescribing. The most important contribution of Kautilya's Arthashastra has been Mandala Theory of foreign policy. Mandala Theory of foreign policy is one of the most efficient method of what you call statecraft, right, where the peace and stability may be established by the state, which closely corresponds with what we call economic prosperity, right. And he says that if you look at the quotation that he makes is asantusht yathijaya nashtaya santusht yascha mir bhuja. That means Brahmins who are not contented are destroyed. so are kings who are contented. As a king, you should never practice contentment, because the moment you bring about contentment, that brings about what you call sluggishness, and that saturates the entire state, and probably the destruction, what you call the state becomes starts decaying the moment, right. So kings should always be in a position to explore new avenues, right, and for that he identifies through geopolitical system multiple categories of state, and what kind of relationship one state or the king or the leader must maintain with other states, and says that there is a first kind of state that he identifies as Ari, which means enemy. That means the immediate neighbor is always your enemy or a rival, right. So the kind of relationship that you must bring about is very cautious, should always look at every movement of your neighboring state with caution, with suspicion, right. That kind of relationship he prescribes, and then he prescribes the other kind of state is Mitra or ally, the ally of the king, and that is the enemy of your enemy is your ally. You should try to bring about alliance with the enemy of your enemy, right. Arimitra is an ally of the enemy, right, and if your enemy has certain kind of ally, that must be treated as Arimitra, right, ally of the enemy. And then Mitra is ally of the ally, is always considered as a closest friend. Then Madhyama is a powerful intermediate state capable of influencing outcomes, and then Udasina or neutral or distant power, right. So these are the kinds of state that exist, and the king or the leader must identify and recognize the role of each and every kind of state around him, and therefore he must practice that kind of diplomacy or must maintain that kind of relationship which brings about the prosperity to the state and at the same time bring about peace through diplomacy, right. So he must keep in mind what kind of states are around the country, and he must be very careful in bringing about the relationship with these states for the development, prosperity and peace of the state, because if the peace is established in the state, that would result in what we call economic prosperity. So what kind of strategic implications are of Mandala theory of foreign policy that he has been talking about is that it suggests that rulers should always form strategic alliances, right, depending upon the trade, the business, and for security they must form strategic alliances with the states which are allies and allies of the allies and friends, and at the same time exploit the rivalries among opponents. That the leader must be efficient enough that he must make other states fight and then exploit the rivalries of the other states, because if the two states are involved among themselves, probably the state of the leader would be comparatively safe, right. And also maintain balance of power. Make sure that any state within that particular region doesn't become too powerful, because that might have some negative consequences for your state. So you must maintain a balance of power with that particular emerging power. Use diplomacy before conflict. Try to avoid any kind of conflict or situation of war with any state, because diplomacy, this condition of war might destroy the comparative peace that your state is enjoying, right. Therefore, you should practice diplomacy over any kind of conflict. Now, if we look at the relevance of Arthashastra in modern leadership, we find that Arthashastra principles inform modern ideas of transparent governance, that the government which is always engaged in bringing about economic prosperity, collecting taxes, but at the same time very transparent, right, and accountable. And it also talks about the sustainable economic policies, that the state must adopt those kinds of economic policies which are quite sustainable, right. It also at the same time talks about a very modern idea of anti-corruption mechanisms, right. This is one of the most I think relevant contribution of Arthashastra, and at the same time finally, which is at the crux of the entire leadership ideas of Indian knowledge system, is welfare oriented leadership. The leadership must be a servant leadership. It must be based on the welfare of the larger public. These principles are increasingly relevant in global corporate leadership even today. So, in order to conclude this particular lecture, we find that in today's discussion, we find that Arthashastra is not merely an ancient political treatise. It represents a very sophisticated framework of governance, of financial administration, ethical leadership and strategic management. And I hope I have been in a position to demonstrate that Kautilya's insights are very relevant in the not only that ancient Indian thought, but also in order to demonstrate the principles of modern management theory. I think each and every thing that I have discussed in today's lecture in context with Kautilya's Arthashastra are very relevant in modern times, and therefore we can learn a lot, particularly in bringing about economic prosperity to the state. You must always learn from Kautilya's Arthashastra. Thank you. If you have any questions or doubt, kindly let me know.